Olivia Sanders had lived in her pale blue two-story house for almost 12 years, long enough to know every sound her street made, from the slow hum of morning commuters to the soft, irregular clatter of branches tapping against the street lamps in a breeze. Her home sat on the corner where the asphalt curled into a quiet loop, a spot that had always felt like a small refuge from the busier streets beyond. From her living room window, framed with long linen curtains she had chosen herself, she could see the manicured lawns across the road, the carefully spaced maple trees, and the pale gold house that had been empty for nearly 8 months. It wasn't unusual for houses in the neighborhood to change hands slowly. The residents here tended to hold on to their properties for years, and when someone did move, the process was quiet, unhurried, and without spectacle. So when the for sale sign finally vanished from the front yard of that empty property, Olivia barely noticed at first, assuming another family had moved in and would take some time to settle. A week later, however, she was watering her row of lavender bushes when a black SUV pulled into the driveway opposite hers, and out stepped a tall, sharply dressed woman in her late 50s with immaculately styled hair, dark sunglasses despite the cloudy afternoon, and a manner of walking that suggested the entire street was already under her inspection. She was followed by 2 men carrying boxes who moved briskly, ignoring Olivia entirely. The woman gave Olivia a polite smile. Polite in the way that's practiced for effect, not warmth, and introduced herself in a voice that carried just a bit too far, as if wanting anyone nearby to hear. "Linda Carter, your new neighbor," she said, her eyes already glancing past Olivia's shoulder toward her front porch, the state of the paint on the railing, the condition of the hedge along the property line. Olivia returned the greeting with the same guarded politeness, sensing instantly that this was the kind of neighbor who didn't just notice details but stored them away to be discussed later. Over the next few days, she would occasionally catch sight of Linda outside, not doing anything in particular, just standing in her yard with her phone in hand, facing Olivia's property as if comparing it to some invisible checklist. Then, one crisp autumn morning, Olivia noticed something new. A narrow metal fixture mounted high on Linda's garage wall, aimed not at the driveway or the street, but directly toward Olivia's front yard and living room windows. The device was no bigger than a shoebox, with a dark glass dome at the top and a small horn-shaped speaker below. At first she assumed it might be a decorative security light or some sort of novelty garden feature, though its positioning struck her as strange. That assumption lasted less than 24 hours. The next day, just after sunrise, Olivia stepped outside to bring in her empty trash bins, and without warning the air split open with an ear-piercing wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating in her chest and echoing through the otherwise silent street. The sound was not the quick descending blip of a car alarm but a sustained, jagged shriek that rose and fell erratically, like an old siren struggling to decide whether to keep going or die out. She froze in confusion, scanning the street for some emergency until her eyes caught the small metal box across the road. The speaker beneath the dome was pointed straight at her. The moment she stepped back toward her front steps, the wail cut off. She stood there, stunned, her ears ringing. Linda emerged from her house a few minutes later, dressed as if for a casual luncheon, waved as though nothing unusual had happened, and walked to her mailbox. "Oh, that," she said lightly when Olivia mentioned the noise. "It's just a motion-activated deterrent, keeps raccoons and stray cats away from my garden. I suppose it might be a little sensitive." Then she smiled, a slow, knowing kind of smile that did nothing to reassure. Olivia nodded politely, but as she closed her front door, she had the distinct feeling that the device wasn't meant for raccoons at all, and for the first time in years, her home didn't feel entirely her own. The following week made it clear that whatever Linda had installed on her garage wall was no harmless garden accessory, nor an overzealous pest deterrent that just happened to be aimed at Olivia's home. It was deliberate, calculated, and growing bolder by the day. The pattern began subtly, almost as if Linda were testing the boundaries of what she could get away with. The first incident after their brief conversation occurred on a breezy Wednesday morning, when Olivia, coffee mug in hand, opened her front door to let in the cool air. She had barely stepped onto the porch before the now familiar mechanical howl exploded into life, shattering the quiet and making her grip tighten instinctively on the ceramic handle. The sound seemed to coil itself around her head, making it impossible to think, let alone enjoy the morning. She retreated inside, and just as her foot crossed the threshold, the siren abruptly stopped. A coincidence, she told herself, but an uneasy one. The next day it happened again, this time when she stepped into her front yard to trim the lavender bushes. The moment her shadow crossed the edge of the driveway, the wailing began. She lingered intentionally for a few moments, pruning slowly just to see if it would stop. It didn't. Only when she walked back toward her door did the noise cut off with a sharpness that felt almost mocking. By the third day, Olivia knew this was no fluke. She began to notice that the siren didn't just respond to her presence outdoors. Even if she was inside but near the window, passing by with a laundry basket, standing at the sink to rinse a cup, pausing to read something in the afternoon light, it could erupt without warning, the shriek cutting through the glass as if the pain were made of tissue. The device was somehow sensitive enough to detect her movement through the window, and each time it went off, she could feel her heart jump in her chest as adrenaline surged involuntarily. When she ventured to bring it up to Linda again, the exchange was brief and loaded with the kind of false courtesy that made her skin prickle. Linda claimed she had adjusted the settings to be more responsive to wildlife after seeing a fox in the area, and added with a shrug that it might be picking up other motion in the background, but there was nothing she could do about it without compromising her garden's safety. The tone was light but dismissive, the kind of conversation closer that left no room for argument without seeming confrontational. Olivia walked back to her own house that afternoon with the distinct sensation that she had just been brushed aside like a trivial nuisance. Over the next few days, the intrusions escalated. One Saturday, she hosted a small lunch for a friend she hadn't seen in months, and within minutes of her guest stepping onto the porch, the siren wailed so loudly they couldn't hear each other speak until they went inside and closed all the windows. The following Monday, it erupted twice in the span of an hour simply because she opened her front door to water the potted plants and later stepped out to retrieve the mail. By Tuesday night, Olivia found herself moving differently around her own home, avoiding the front rooms, keeping curtains drawn during the day, and slipping quickly in and out of the door as though she were trying to evade detection in her own life. It was the first time she realized that the device wasn't just an inconvenience, it was beginning to dictate her behavior. The breaking point came late on a Thursday evening. She was sitting in the living room with the lamp on low, reading, when the siren screamed without warning, its jagged pitch cutting through the thin veil of quiet as if the air itself had been torn open. She jumped up, startled, and through the curtains she saw Linda standing in her own driveway, not making any move to turn off the noise. She wasn't even looking at her garden or pretending to adjust the device. She was looking directly at Olivia's window, one hand casually resting on her hip, the other holding what looked like a small remote. The sound finally ceased after nearly a full minute, leaving behind the pounding echo of Olivia's heartbeat and the faint hiss of blood rushing in her ears. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house seemed sharper, every flicker of light from passing cars a reminder that at any moment, that awful noise could tear into the night again. She began to consider what her next steps should be, though the thought of an open confrontation made her uneasy. Something about Linda's calm, unwavering stare earlier had carried a weight beyond simple neighborly friction. The next morning, her suspicion deepened. She left for the grocery store mid-morning and returned less than an hour later to find the siren blaring as she pulled into her driveway, despite the fact that she hadn't even stepped out of the car yet. As she turned off the engine, she looked across the street and saw Linda through her front window, standing perfectly still and watching. The moment Olivia opened her car door, the siren cut off as if on cue. There was no raccoon, no stray cat, no logical excuse. only a neighbor who was using a piece of technology to send a message loud enough for the entire street to hear. That was the moment Olivia understood this wasn't about animals or property protection. This was about her. And whatever Linda's reasons were, she intended to make sure Olivia heard them, day after day, until she either broke or left. Olivia had reached a point where ignoring the problem was no longer an option. The siren had begun to dictate the rhythm of her days, and every time it blared, she felt the tension coil a little tighter in her shoulders. She decided that if Linda was going to play this as a calculated campaign, she would have to respond in a way that was measured, precise, and irrefutably documented. One impulsive outburst, one moment of visible frustration, and Linda would twist it into proof that Olivia was the one making trouble. The first step was to start keeping a detailed record. She bought a large, hardbound notebook and began logging every single incident with the exact date, time, and circumstances, noting whether she had been outside, inside near a window, or simply arriving in her car. Alongside the log, she purchased a small handheld decibel meter from a hardware store, something inexpensive but reliable enough to provide quantifiable readings. She would hold it at chest height whenever the siren went off, recording the levels, which regularly spiked far beyond what local noise ordinances allowed. This was not the kind of evidence someone could wave away as subjective annoyance. It was cold, measurable data. Within a week, the notebook was already filling with entries, and patterns were emerging. The device seemed most active in the mornings between 7 and 9, late afternoons around 5, and occasionally in the evenings if she so much as passed by the living room. There were days when it triggered 6 or 7 times without any logical cause, even in weather calm enough that not a single leaf moved on the trees. With this information, Olivia decided it was time to bring in outside authority. She visited the local police station, a modest brick building with a perpetually humming fluorescent light over the reception desk, and spoke to an officer about filing a complaint. The officer listened politely, reviewed a few pages of her log, and said they could send someone to take a statement and perhaps speak to Linda informally. But without corroborating witnesses or multiple households affected, there was little they could enforce under current regulations. It was not the decisive action Olivia had hoped for, but it was a start. That afternoon, a patrol car stopped by her street. 2 officers spoke briefly with Linda in her driveway. Olivia watched from her window, heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Linda maintained a pleasant smile throughout, gesturing occasionally toward her garden and nodding as if receiving helpful advice. When the officers left, she turned her gaze toward Olivia's house, the smile still fixed, but her eyes sharper now, almost amused. The siren stayed silent for the rest of that day, which felt like a small victory, until the next morning. At exactly 7:15, Olivia stepped onto her porch with a cup of coffee and the decibel meter in hand, and the wail erupted instantly, louder than she had ever heard it before. She glanced at the reading. 102 decibels, enough to make her teeth ache. She held her position deliberately, timing how long it would take to stop. It screamed for a full 2 minutes before cutting off, leaving her ears ringing. She logged the incident in detail, knowing this was Linda's way of making it clear that the visit from the police had not changed anything. The escalation wasn't just in volume. Olivia began to notice the device activating at oddly specific times, such as the moment she opened her front door to accept a delivery, or when she returned from errands with grocery bags in both hands, forcing her to endure the noise while juggling the load. Once, as she struggled with an awkwardly heavy box on her porch, the siren blared, and she nearly dropped it down the steps. On another day, she was chatting with a neighbor who had stopped by, and within seconds the wail drowned out their voices, making conversation impossible. The neighbor frowned, muttered something about that thing being a bit much, but quickly excused himself, glancing uneasily toward Linda's house. That was when Olivia realized another layer to the tactic. The siren wasn't just harassment, it was social isolation. If people couldn't comfortably approach her home without being assaulted by that sound, they would stop coming altogether. By the end of the second week, Olivia had enough entries and readings to fill almost half the notebook. She decided to expand her approach by speaking quietly with other residents on the street, asking if they had experienced anything similar or had opinions about the device. Most were polite but non-committal, clearly reluctant to get involved. A few admitted they had heard the siren regularly but didn't want to be dragged into a neighbor dispute. One older man, however, leaned in conspiratorially and said he remembered the previous owners of Olivia's house having all sorts of headaches, with Linda, though he didn't elaborate before changing the subject. Olivia made a note of that in her log as well. With each day that passed, the emotional toll deepened. She found herself sleeping fitfully, waking at the slightest sound and tensing at shadows moving across the drawn curtains. But beneath the fatigue there was a growing resolve. She was not going to be maneuvered into selling her home or retreating from it. She began researching local noise ordinances and property laws, reading through municipal codes late into the night until the language started to make sense. She learned that repeated noise disturbances of a certain volume could qualify as a public nuisance, especially if they appeared targeted. It would require persistence, documentation, and the right channels. But it was possible to fight back. For the first time since the siren began, Olivia felt the faint but steady spark of control returning to her. She wasn't going to let this end with her quietly giving up and disappearing. If Linda wanted a prolonged game, Olivia was ready to play it, but she would play by the rules in a way that left no room for manipulation. By the time October's pale light began to linger in the mornings and the air took on the faint scent of wet leaves, Olivia's logbook had become as much a part of her daily routine as making coffee or checking emails. It lay permanently open on the corner of her dining table, pen resting on its spine, ready for the next entry. The notebook had grown heavy with evidence, pages of dates and times in careful ink, neat decibel readings alongside notes about what she had been doing at the moment the siren screamed to life. It wasn't just a record anymore. It had become a map of Linda's patterns, an almost forensic portrait of the harassment. The intervals, the precision of certain timings, the way the noise would begin the very moment she appeared in the doorway or stepped into view, it was too deliberate to dismiss. Yet, despite her diligence, each official channel she tried felt sluggish, reluctant to intervene without an undeniable trigger. The police visits had produced nothing more than polite conversations and thinly veiled shrugs, and the few neighbors who might have corroborated her experience were unwilling to put themselves in Linda's crosshairs. Olivia understood their hesitance. Linda's manner could be intimidating in its quiet way, a calm mask over something sharper. That sharpness became more apparent one chilly Tuesday when Olivia, bundled in a sweater, stepped into her front yard to gather fallen branches after a storm. She had barely crossed the threshold of her porch before the wail began, so loud it startled a crow from the maple tree. She glanced up, not at the device this time, but at Linda herself, who was standing on her own porch, phone in hand, watching. There was no pretense of tending to the garden or checking the mail, just direct, silent observation, as if gauging how long Olivia would last under the sound. Olivia stayed where she was for almost a full minute, hands tightening around the branch she had picked up, her eyes fixed on the woman across the street. She wanted to show she wasn't afraid, but when she finally retreated inside and shut the door, her hands were trembling from the sustained tension. That evening, after a restless hour of pacing, she decided she couldn't fight this alone. She called Caroline, an old friend from a volunteer committee they had both once served on, someone level-headed and unflappable, who also happened to work as an administrative assistant for the city council. Over tea the next afternoon, Olivia explained everything in measured detail, sliding the notebook across the table. Caroline flipped through the pages slowly, her brow tightening. "You need an official noise assessment," she said finally. "And you'll need it scheduled in a way she doesn't see coming. If she knows the city's sending someone, she'll just turn it off for the day." That made sense. Every time there was a visible authority presence on the street, the siren had remained suspiciously silent. Caroline promised to discreetly connect Olivia with a municipal inspector who could stop by unannounced within the next week. The plan gave Olivia a renewed sense of focus, something to anticipate beyond the daily grind of documenting each blaring intrusion. She still carried on with her routine, careful not to make changes that would signal she was preparing a case. But she noticed Linda watching more often now, not openly hostile, but alert, like someone guarding a secret they suspected was at risk. The unannounced visit happened on a gray Thursday afternoon. The inspector, a tall man with an easy manner, parked 2 streets over and approached on foot. Olivia greeted him quietly at her back door, and together they moved to the living room, where he set up his portable equipment facing the window that took the full brunt of the device's speaker. She didn't have to wait long. 10 minutes later, as if on cue, the siren tore through the air. The inspector glanced at the digital readout, eyebrows lifting. The levels were well above legal limits for a residential area, and the frequency range, he explained in a low voice, was particularly harsh on the human ear. He kept the device running for another minute before shutting it off and jotting down the readings. "This is targeted," he said matter-of-factly, no trace of doubt. "It's not set for general area coverage. The cone is too narrow. Whoever installed it aimed it exactly where they wanted the sound to land." That validation, quiet but firm, was more satisfying than Olivia had expected. It wasn't just her perception anymore. There was now an official acknowledgement that this was intentional. She thanked him, and he promised to compile a formal report and forward it to the appropriate department. That night, Olivia allowed herself a small exhale of relief, but it was short-lived. The following morning, at precisely 8 o'clock, she opened her blinds to find a new addition to Linda's property. A sign mounted just beneath the device, painted in bold red letters. "Security Zone. Motion Alarm Active." It was positioned so that anyone looking out Olivia's window couldn't miss it, the wording almost taunting. If Linda had any idea about the inspection, this was her way of reminding Olivia that she wasn't backing down. The days after the inspection were among the most exhausting yet. The siren seemed to activate more frequently, sometimes twice in 10 minutes, and always at moments when it would be most disruptive. While Olivia was on a video call for work, speaking on the phone, or simply trying to enjoy a rare, quiet evening with music playing softly in the background. Even indoors with the windows shut, the noise clawed at her concentration. Yet now there was a difference. Every time the wail began, Olivia pictured the inspector's calm certainty, the numbers on his meter, the precise language he had used. It wasn't just her word against Linda's anymore. There was evidence in the hands of someone who knew exactly what it meant. The balance hadn't shifted entirely, but there was weight on her side of the scale now, and Linda had to know it. The inspector's visit had given Olivia a rare flicker of confidence, but in the days that followed she learned that victories in this battle would never be simple or uncontested. If Linda had sensed that Olivia was beginning to gather leverage, she responded with a new phase of pressure, more cunning, more invasive, and aimed at wearing her down in ways that were harder to measure with a decibel meter. The siren was still her primary weapon, but now it was paired with other tactics that seemed calculated to tighten the noose. The first sign came one Saturday morning when Olivia stepped out to check her mailbox and found a folded sheet of paper tucked inside, not delivered through the postal system but slipped in by hand. The paper contained a list, written in neat block letters, of supposed infractions committed on her property. Weeds visible from the sidewalk, porch light left on overnight, and unknown visitors arriving after dark. There was no signature, but the tone was unmistakably Linda's, formal but dripping with insinuation, each line phrased as if it were part of an official record. Olivia set it aside, unwilling to give it the satisfaction of an immediate reaction, but she added an entry to her log. 2 days later, she discovered a second note, this one taped directly to her front gate, repeating the infractions and adding the phrase, "Consider relocation if unable to maintain standards." It was blatant in its intent, and it made clear that the Siren was only one layer of a campaign designed to drive her out. Olivia's instinct was to go back to Caroline, who had been her quiet source of advice since the inspection. They met in a small cafe 2 neighborhoods over to avoid the possibility of being seen together on their street. Olivia laid out the notes on the table, alongside her logbook and the growing stack of printed decibel readings. Caroline studied them silently, then told her it was time to involve a lawyer, not to threaten or escalate publicly yet, but to create a shield. "If you have representation, any further contact from her should go through them," she said. "It changes the dynamic. It tells her she's no longer dealing with someone she can intimidate directly." Olivia took the advice seriously, and after 2 days of searching found a local attorney with experience in nuisance and harassment cases. The initial meeting was sobering. The lawyer explained that while the siren and the notes were forms of harassment, the process of securing a formal injunction would be slow unless they could show that the behavior was causing measurable harm or danger. The decibel readings were a good start, but more would be needed. Photographs of the notes in place, witness statements, and ideally confirmation from other residents that the siren was not used in a general manner but aimed specifically at Olivia's home. It was a frustrating but realistic assessment, and Olivia agreed to begin collecting the additional evidence. Linda, whether by intuition or observation, seemed to sense this shift. She began activating the siren at even more targeted moments, often waiting until Olivia was midway through something that would be hard to interrupt: a phone call with a client, unloading groceries in the rain, or tending to the narrow strip of garden by her driveway. On one particularly raw, windy afternoon, the noise erupted just as Olivia was kneeling to adjust a loose board in the fence, the sound so sudden and close that she lost her balance and scraped her hand on the wood. It wasn't a serious injury, but it deepened her conviction that this was more than a petty feud. It was a sustained attempt to create discomfort and possibly cause accidents. What made it worse was that the social isolation was beginning to take hold. Neighbors who had once exchanged casual greetings now offered little more than quick nods, their eyes sliding away as if unsure where their loyalties should lie. One woman, who had been friendly enough to share cuttings from her rose bushes last year, crossed the street to avoid passing directly in front of Olivia's house. Whether Linda had been speaking to them privately or whether they were simply avoiding the tension, the result was the same. Olivia felt the circle closing in. Her lawyer advised patience, warning that provocations were often designed to elicit emotional responses that could later be used against her. So she resisted the temptation to confront Linda directly, instead focusing on documentation. She began keeping her phone within reach when outside, not to film arguments but to quietly capture images of the notes, the placement of the siren, and any moments when Linda stood outside during its activation. This wasn't a dramatic detective story. There were no late-night stakeouts or dramatic confrontations, but a slow, deliberate gathering of the kind of evidence that could withstand scrutiny. Still, the pressure was constant. On the Thursday before the lawyer was due to file the first round of complaints, Olivia returned from a meeting to find a new sign on Linda's lawn, positioned so it faced directly into her living room windows. It read, in bold black letters, "This property protected. Trespassers will be prosecuted," with a smaller line underneath warning of audio deterrence in use. It was legalistic and impersonal, yet the placement made its intent personal. That night, as she sat in her dimly lit kitchen, sipping tea and listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, Olivia realized the escalation was no longer just about noise. It was about control. Control over the atmosphere of the street, over her comfort in her own home, over the very idea of who had the right to remain here. The fight was no longer about enduring the sound. It was about proving she would not be moved by it. The turning point came on a damp, overcast Monday that seemed quiet enough to pass without incident. Olivia had been working in her study most of the morning, the steady patter of rain on the roof masking her unease, when a knock at the door startled her. It was the municipal noise inspector from before, accompanied this time by a uniformed officer and a man she didn't recognize, who introduced himself as a representative from the city's Code Enforcement Division. Caroline had quietly arranged for a follow-up inspection, this one official and documented, and it seemed the timing was intentionally kept secret. They explained that they wanted to perform a targeted reading and visual inspection to confirm the earlier findings. Olivia agreed, and they set up their equipment in her living room, just as before. The inspector positioned the sensors directly toward Linda's property, noting the exact angle of the device mounted on her garage. For several long minutes, nothing happened. The rain softened to a drizzle, and Olivia began to wonder if Linda had somehow sensed the visit. Then, as if summoned by the thought, the siren erupted, louder and sharper than ever. The inspector's equipment registered the spike immediately, and the code enforcement officer took photographs of the device in action, its speaker aimed like a spotlight on Olivia's windows. The officer crossed the street without hesitation, knocking on Linda's door. Through the rain-streaked glass, Olivia could see her neighbor appear, smiling politely at first, then frowning as the questions began. The conversation was too muffled to hear, but the body language told the story. Linda's folded arms, the way she stepped back defensively, and the eventual shake of her head. The officer gestured toward the device, speaking in a tone that brooked no argument. Within minutes, the siren was silent, and the officer was taking notes while Linda stood stiffly by. When the group returned, the inspector informed Olivia that the readings left no doubt. The sound level was far above the permissible limit, and the targeting was deliberate. The code enforcement officer confirmed that the device was not registered with the city as required for any outdoor alarm system, making its installation a violation in itself. They would be issuing an immediate order for removal, along with a fine for non-compliance. Olivia felt the air shift inside her chest, a cautious relief that she didn't dare celebrate yet. That evening, she watched from her kitchen window as Linda, under the watchful eyes of two enforcement officials, climbed a short ladder and began unbolting the device from her garage wall. She moved slowly, her mouth set in a thin line, each metallic clink of the wrench ringing louder than the siren had in that moment. When the unit finally came down, she handed it over without looking at Olivia's house, her posture rigid and unreadable. The next morning was the first in months when Olivia stepped outside without bracing herself for the inevitable burst of noise. The street felt different, quieter but also lighter, as if some invisible tension had been cut. Still, she knew this wasn't a story with clean edges. Linda's glares from across the way carried the promise that this was not over, even if the siren was gone. Yet, for the first time since this began, Olivia stood in her own yard, breathing in the damp air after the rain, and realized she could hear only the distant rumble of traffic and the soft rustle of leaves. It wasn't complete peace, but it was proof that she could reclaim her space, and that was enough for now. The days that followed felt almost unnatural in their stillness, as though the street itself was recovering from an illness it had carried for too long. Olivia found herself pausing in the mornings just to listen to the quiet, the absence of that piercing wail making her aware of how much space it had occupied in her mind. She resumed small routines she had abandoned months ago, watering the front garden without glancing over her shoulder, leaving the blinds open to let in the afternoon light, sitting with a book in the living room without the constant readiness to flinch. Yet she did not mistake this for complete safety. Linda still lived across the street, and while the device was gone, her presence was as deliberate as ever. There were moments when Olivia caught her lingering at the mailbox or staring briefly from a window, but the gestures carried less weight now, stripped of the sonic weapon that had once backed them. The lawyer advised her to keep the logbook going, not from fear, but as a matter of preparedness, a way to ensure that if there were ever another attempt, she would not be starting from nothing. Over time, the neighborhood's posture seemed to loosen. A few neighbors began to greet her again, cautiously at first, then more naturally, as though the silence had broken a spell. Caroline stopped by one Saturday with a bottle of wine, and they sat on the porch long after sunset, talking in low voices about anything but the months that had passed. Olivia knew the memory of that sound would linger for a long time. How it had seeped into her sleep, dictated her movements, and made her own home feel like contested ground. But she also understood that endurance had its own kind of quiet power. She had not left. She had not been pushed out. And as she locked the front door that night, the air cool and still around her, she felt something almost foreign in her chest. A steady, unhurried calm that told her the worst of the storm had passed.